Let the present moment soften for a while. The noise of today does not need to follow you here. What we are about to explore unfolds on a much longer scale, where centuries pass like slow breaths, and memory is carried quietly through stone, story, and sky. Humanity has always watched the heavens in moments of uncertainty. Long before instruments and equations, there was observation, patience, and the instinct that the sky was not random, but patterned. When something unusual appeared above, people remembered, they recorded, they warned those who came after. Tonight, we return to one of those moments of watching, a moment where ancient memory and modern signals seem to overlap, inviting us not to panic, but to pay attention. There are times in human history when attention turns upward almost instinctively, not in worship alone, but in recognition. Something in the sky appears out of place, and across cultures and eras, that displacement triggers the same quiet response. People begin to search their records. They compare what they see now with what was seen before. In our own time, the object designated as 3-Eye Atlas has become one of those moments, not because it confirms an answer, but because it reopens a question humanity has asked many times before. If these investigations into deep time and recurring patterns speak to you, you may choose to subscribe, not out of urgency, but as a way of returning to this ongoing reflection whenever the surface of the present world feels too loud. 3-Eye Atlas enters the modern record as a signal, an interstellar visitor, observed, measured, catalogued. In scientific terms, it is described with caution and restraint. Yet beneath the data lies something more subtle. Its arrival echoes a familiar rhythm. Throughout ancient traditions, unusual celestial movements are not isolated curiosities. They are markers. They appear at turning points, moments when the established order is about to change. Ancient texts rarely separate sky and earth. What moves above is reflected below. In Sumerian records, celestial signs precede decisions that reshape the world. Before the flood of Ziusudra, the gods observed disturbances, not only among humanity, but within the larger order they oversee. The warning is delivered quietly, almost reluctantly. Survival is possible, but only for those who understand that the system itself is entering correction. The biblical narrative preserves this same architecture. Long before rain falls, the sky becomes a source of instruction. Time is granted not to prevent the event, but to prepare for it. The flood is not sudden, it is anticipated. The ark is constructed under open heavens, as though the warning were written into the world itself for anyone willing to see it. When we widen the lens, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In Mesoamerican traditions, celestial irregularities mark the end of previous ages. Suns fail, cycles collapse, and floods follow as consequences rather than causes. In Asia and the Pacific, stories of rising waters are intertwined with accounts of strange stars, wandering lights, and shifts in the movements that once guided navigation and agriculture. What connects these traditions is not fear of water, but awareness of sequence. First comes the sign, then the warning, then survival for a limited few. Finally, a reset that redraws the boundaries of land, memory, and possibility. The flood is never the beginning of the story. It is the outcome. This is where 3-Eye Atlas becomes relevant beyond astronomy. Its significance is not in what it is, but in what it represents. A reminder that humanity has always associated unusual celestial arrivals with cycles far larger than individual lifetimes. Whether symbolic or literal, these moments trigger preservation behaviors. Records are revisited. Stories are retold. Patterns are compared. The ancient world did not experience floods as isolated disasters. They experienced them as chapters in a repeating process, a process initiated above, completed below, and remembered through myth, ritual, and cautionary tale. If those memories survived thousands of years, it may be because they were not meant only for the past, but for moments like this one, when the sky once again invites comparison and the old question quietly returns. That returning question reshapes how the flood itself is understood. If celestial signals mark the beginning of a sequence, then the flood becomes less of a random catastrophe and more of a final phase. In this light, water is not the cause, but the instrument. The visible reset follows an invisible shift that has already taken place. Ancient cultures, lacking modern terminology, described this relationship through story, but the structure of their accounts remains precise. In Mesopotamia, the flood does not emerge from chaos. It follows deliberation. The heavens are consulted, thresholds are crossed, and only then does the decision descend into the physical world. Ziusudra is not chosen for moral perfection, but for attentiveness. He listens. He observes. He responds to a warning embedded in the fabric of the cosmos itself. His survival ensures that memory continues beyond the reset, that the sequence is not lost. The Hebrew narrative echoes this attentiveness. Noah's story unfolds over decades, not days. The warning stretches across generations. The sky becomes a clock counting down toward inevitability. When the flood finally arrives, it confirms something already understood. The event does not surprise the prepared. It only overwhelms those who dismissed the signs as meaningless or impossible. Across the Americas, flood traditions preserve an even clearer connection between sky and reset. In Mesoamerican cosmology, worlds end when celestial order collapses. Each age is governed by a sun, and when that sun fails, the supporting systems of life unravel. Floods erase previous creations not as punishment, but as necessity. Humanity is reshaped because the cosmic environment that sustained earlier forms no longer exists. Survival belongs to those aligned with the new order. In Asia, flood heroes like Yu the Great are remembered not for escaping the waters, but for restoring balance afterward. The flood is treated as a known phase of disruption, one that must be managed rather than feared. This implies expectation. The culture remembers that floods come in cycles, often following disturbances that originate beyond the earth itself. Water becomes the medium through which balance is reestablished. Pacific traditions carry this memory across oceans. Stories of submerged islands and ancestral migrations are inseparable from accounts of changing stars and shifting navigation paths. When the sky no longer behaves as expected, the sea responds. Entire homelands disappear, not gradually, but within remembered time. Survival depends on reading the heavens correctly and moving before the reset completes itself. What becomes increasingly clear is that ancient flood narratives are not isolated inventions. They are distributed records of a shared experience, filtered through local language but preserving the same sequence: warning, preparation, survival, reset, renewal. This consistency persists even among cultures with no known contact, separated by vast distances and deep time. Modern science often approaches floods through geology and climate alone. Ice melt, tectonics, rainfall patterns. These explanations describe the mechanism, but not the trigger remembered by ancient observers. The old stories insist that something changes first in the sky, that once certain thresholds are crossed, the outcome below becomes unavoidable. This is why the appearance of Three-Eye Atlas resonates beyond academic interest. It reactivates an ancient reflex, to look backward through records when something unusual appears above, to ask whether similar signals once preceded the most disruptive chapters in human memory. The flood myths do not claim certainty. They preserve sequence, and in that preservation lies their quiet warning, waiting patiently for those willing to notice when the pattern begins to repeat. That idea of sequence invites a closer examination of what survives a reset and why. Flood narratives are rarely concerned with total annihilation. Instead, they focus with unusual precision on preservation. Seeds, animals, measurements, genealogies, rituals, and laws are carried forward as though the primary objective were not survival of bodies alone, but continuity of structure. Something essential must pass through the waters intact. In the Sumerian account, Utnapishtim does not simply outlast the flood. He emerges with knowledge sanctioned by the gods themselves. The post-flood world is not a blank slate. It is a reconstruction guided by remembered order. Measurements are restored. Kingship returns. Time resumes its count. The reset clears excess, but it does not erase the blueprint. That blueprint appears to originate beyond humanity, entrusted temporarily, then reclaimed. The biblical narrative reinforces this emphasis. After the flood, the first acts are not conquest or exploration, but covenant and accounting. Boundaries are reestablished. Seasons are reaffirmed. Humanity is reminded of its place within a larger system. The rainbow, often romanticized, functions in the story as a marker of cycle awareness, a sign that links sky and earth, memory and recurrence. It is not a promise of non-return, but a reminder of observation. Mesoamerican traditions describe survivors who carry calendars, not weapons. Timekeeping becomes sacred because it preserves alignment with cosmic cycles. After the flood, new ages begin, each governed by different conditions. Humanity adapts not by dominance, but by synchronization. Those who fail to align are lost in subsequent resets. Survival, in these accounts, is a matter of rhythm rather than strength. Across Asia, flood survivors are remembered as culture bearers. Yu the Great restores irrigation, not by stopping the water entirely, but by guiding it. This distinction is critical. The flood is not framed as an enemy to defeat, but a force to work with. Water reshapes the land, and humanity reshapes itself in response. The lesson is not resistance, but cooperation with cycles already in motion. In Pacific cultures, the preservation focus extends to navigation knowledge. Star paths, ocean currents, and wind patterns are encoded into chant and story so they cannot be lost, even if land itself disappears. When islands sink beneath rising seas, what survives is the map carried in memory. This suggests an expectation of displacement, a readiness for movement triggered by changes above and below. When these preservation themes are viewed together, they suggest that floods were understood as transitional events, not endings, but passages. The world before and the world after are connected by intentional continuity. Someone always knows what to carry forward. Someone always receives a warning early enough to act. This implies that resets, while devastating, were not entirely unpredictable. Here, the modern appearance of Three-Eye Atlas introduces an uncomfortable resonance. It does not announce a flood, it does not predict disaster, but it occupies the same narrative position as earlier celestial anomalies. A moment that draws attention, encourages record comparison, and quietly asks what should be preserved if cycles repeat. The ancient response to such moments was not panic, but preparation. What is striking is how little emphasis ancient cultures placed on preventing the reset. The flood is treated as inevitable once certain thresholds are crossed. Effort is redirected toward continuity rather than control. This worldview challenges modern assumptions of mastery over nature. It suggests that some processes are larger than intervention, governed by dynamics humanity can observe but not command. As these stories converge, a subtle implication emerges. If floods follow celestial disturbances, and if survival depends on recognition and preparation, then the true lesson preserved across civilizations is not about water at all. It is about attentiveness, about knowing when a cycle is nearing completion, and understanding what must be carried forward when the world prepares once again to begin differently. That emphasis on attentiveness leads naturally to the idea of reset as a repeating condition rather than a singular catastrophe. In ancient memory, the flood is not unique. It is one instance within a longer rhythm, a punctuation mark in an ongoing sentence written across millennia. Civilizations did not remember only one deluge, but many, each associated with the ending of an age and the quiet beginning of another. The world does not simply end, it sheds a layer. This perspective reframes destruction as transition. In Sumerian king lists, reigns before the flood stretch impossibly long, while those after are shortened, restrained, more fragile. Time itself behaves differently on either side of the reset. This is not presented as error, but as consequence. Something fundamental has changed in the operating conditions of the world. The flood marks the boundary between two modes of existence. The same boundary appears in biblical chronology. Lifespans contract sharply after the flood. The environment becomes harsher, less forgiving. Humanity must work the land with greater effort. These shifts suggest memory of environmental transformation, but they are framed within a cosmic context. The heavens are still present, still watching, but the terms of survival have altered. The reset is complete. Mesoamerican traditions describe this process with even greater precision. Each age ends through a different form of collapse, yet water remains a recurring agent of erasure. Floods wash away previous creations when the balance between sky and earth can no longer be maintained. Afterward, new humans are formed from different materials, better suited to the altered conditions. These stories preserve adaptation across resets, not nostalgia for what was lost. In Asian records, floods are linked to dynastic renewal. The mandate to rule is withdrawn and restored, reflecting a belief that political order is inseparable from cosmic order. When floods overwhelm the land, it is understood that authority has fallen out of alignment. Restoration comes not through force, but through re-establishing harmony between human systems and the larger cycles governing them. Pacific narratives extend this understanding into geography itself. Entire landscapes are remembered as temporary. Mountains sink, islands vanish, coastlines migrate. What appears stable within one lifetime is revealed as fragile across generations. Floods redraw the map, and memory becomes the only constant. This reinforces a worldview in which permanence is illusion and readiness is survival. When these accounts are read together, they form a global archive of resets, not identical events, but structurally similar experiences. Each begins with imbalance, often signaled by the sky. Each proceeds through water, erasure, and dislocation. Each ends with reordering, continuity, and restraint. The flood is not an anomaly, it is a mechanism. This is where modern discussions of abrupt climate shifts begin to intersect with ancient memory. Geological evidence points to periods of rapid warming, sudden sea level rise, and widespread flooding. The Younger Dryas stands as one such interval, a time when conditions changed faster than ecosystems could adapt. While science describes the process through data, the stories describe the experience of living through it. Ancient cultures did not separate sky events from environmental response. A disturbance above could trigger collapse below. Comets, wandering stars, changes in solar behavior, all were observed and remembered as potential initiators of chaos. Whether these interpretations were literal or symbolic, they preserved awareness of vulnerability. The world could change quickly and without consent. Against this backdrop, the presence of 3-Eye Atlas in the modern sky takes on narrative weight, not as a harbinger, but as a reminder. It occupies the same category as earlier anomalies that compelled societies to look backward, to compare, to prepare. The question is not whether a flood is coming, but whether humanity still recognizes the signs that once framed its survival. The ancient answer to reset was not fear, but humility, acceptance that cycles exist beyond control and that wisdom lies in alignment rather than resistance. Floods, in this sense, were teachers. They erased excess, forced adaptation, and redefined what it meant to endure. And as long as those lessons remain remembered, the reset is never total, only transformative. That transformation brings the discussion closer to the present, where memory and evidence begin to overlap in unexpected ways. Ancient narratives describe floods as lived experiences, but modern science approaches them through layers of sediment, ice cores, and disrupted coastlines. When these two perspectives are placed side by side, the distance between myth and measurement narrows. Both speak of abrupt change. Both point to moments when when gradual processes accelerate beyond expectation. Geological records reveal that sea levels have not always risen slowly. There are intervals where vast amounts of ice melted in short spans of time, sending water across continental shelves and into low-lying regions. Entire coastlines vanished. Human populations were displaced inland or forced to migrate along newly formed shores. These events align uncannily with the timelines preserved in flood traditions, suggesting that memory may have carried forward what instruments only later confirmed. The Younger Dryas remains one of the most discussed of these intervals. It marks a sudden return to colder conditions, followed by an equally rapid warming. This instability would have stressed ecosystems, altered rainfall patterns, and triggered widespread flooding as ice sheets destabilized. While the scientific debate continues over precise causes, the effect is clear. The world changed quickly, and humanity had to adapt or disappear. What ancient stories add to this picture is the insistence that such changes were not entirely unforeseen. They remember a buildup, a sense that the environment was becoming unpredictable, that seasons no longer behaved as expected, that the sky itself seemed different. These observations may not meet modern standards of data, but they reflect attentive living within natural systems, where small anomalies carried significant meaning. In this context, celestial phenomena take on renewed importance. Cometary debris, increased meteor activity, or shifts in solar behavior could have amplified climatic instability. Ancient observers, lacking scientific language, described these events through divine symbolism. Yet the consistent placement of sky disturbances before floods suggests that they were noting correlation, not inventing drama. The idea of a reset hypothesis emerges from this convergence. That humanity has experienced multiple periods where environmental thresholds were crossed rapidly, forcing large-scale reorganization. Floods become the visible expression of deeper systemic change. They are how resets are felt, remembered, and narrated. Water erases, but it also reveals new boundaries. This perspective reframes the role of flood survivors. They are not chosen arbitrarily. They are those positioned by geography or knowledge to endure transition. High ground, mobile lifeways, stored resources, and preserved knowledge all increase resilience. Ancient texts elevate these practical advantages into moral or divine favor, encoding survival strategies into story. Here again, the modern appearance of Three-Eye Atlas becomes symbolically charged. It does not provide evidence of imminent catastrophe, but it reactivates an old habit of attention. When something unfamiliar enters the sky, the appropriate response is not fear, but review. What happened the last time the world changed quickly? What knowledge was preserved? What mistakes were repeated? Flood myths, when stripped of sensationalism, read like cautionary archives. They remind future generations that stability is temporary and that resilience lies in preparation, memory, and humility. The reset does not announce itself loudly. It arrives after long disregard, when systems quietly reach their limit. As the ancient and modern records begin to echo one another, a sobering realization takes shape. Humanity has likely faced global resets before, survived them, and then slowly forgotten the conditions that led there. If that is true, then the most dangerous moment is not the flood itself, but the period of confidence that precedes it, when signs are visible yet dismissed, and the sky is watched only by those who still remember why it matters. That period of confidence, so often described just before a reset, is remembered with unusual clarity in ancient accounts. Civilizations portray themselves at their most advanced, most populous, and most assured shortly before the flood arrives. There is abundance, structure, and belief in permanence. This detail matters because it suggests that vulnerability is not always paired with decline. Sometimes it emerges at the peak of stability. In Mesopotamian texts, the world before the flood is noisy and crowded. Humanity thrives, cities expand, and systems function efficiently. Yet this success creates imbalance. months. The gods are disturbed not by failure, but by excess. The flood is triggered when growth surpasses sustainable limits. This framing transforms the event from punishment into correction, a recalibration of scale. The biblical narrative echoes this condition through moral language. Society continues as normal. People build, trade, marry, and plan for the future. There is no sense of impending collapse among the majority. Only those attentive to the warning understand that continuation has reached its threshold. The flood interrupts ordinary life precisely because ordinary life had become unquestioned. Mesoamerican traditions describe flourishing ages that end abruptly. Cities rise, agriculture expands, calendars are refined. Then celestial order shifts, and the world supporting that complexity collapses. The suddenness of the reset contrasts sharply with the long stability that preceded it. This contrast reinforces the lesson that longevity does not guarantee immunity. In Asian histories, floods often coincide with the height of dynastic power. Prosperity breeds overconfidence, and systems grow rigid. When waters overwhelm the land, the collapse feels shocking, but the stories suggest it was inevitable. The environment could no longer support the existing order. Reset follows saturation. Across the Pacific, oral traditions remember times when islands were fully inhabited, resources abundant, and navigation predictable. Rising seas did not occur in eras of scarcity, but during periods of successful settlement. The disappearance of land forced dispersal, carrying memory across the ocean. Stability was real, but not permanent. This pattern undermines the assumption that disaster announces itself through decline. Instead, ancient memory suggests that resets arrive when systems appear strongest, because that is when imbalance accumulates unnoticed. Warnings are present, but they are subtle, easily ignored amid prosperity. Modern parallels are difficult to avoid. Global systems today are complex, interconnected, and efficient. Data flows faster than ever, yet this complexity increases sensitivity to disruption. Small changes propagate widely. Ancient floods disrupted local worlds. Modern resets would reverberate globally. Within this context, the role of celestial signals becomes clearer. They are not predictors of doom, but indicators of systemic stress. A reminder that the environment does not respond only to human timelines. When unusual objects like 3i Atlas appear, they draw attention because they break expectation. They prompt comparison with earlier moments when expectation failed. Ancient observers did not interpret celestial anomalies as immediate threats. They saw them as markers, points in time that demanded awareness. The flood did not follow instantly. There was space for response, for preservation, for choice. This suggests that the most important phase of a reset is not the moment of impact, but the interval of recognition, the time when patterns can still be compared and lessons still applied. Ancient cultures preserved flood narratives not to terrify future generations, but to remind them that confidence is not proof of safety. If resets are cyclical, then survival depends less on prediction and more on posture. Attentiveness over arrogance, memory over dismissal. The ancient world did not claim certainty about when the waters would rise. It claimed certainty about one thing only, that the signs would appear first, quietly in the sky, long before the ground began to give way. That quiet interval between recognition and impact is where ancient wisdom places its greatest emphasis. Flood stories slow down at this point, lingering on preparation rather than destruction. Time stretches. Decisions are made in uncertainty. The future is not yet sealed, but the trajectory has shifted. This is the space where agency exists, limited but meaningful. In Sumerian accounts, the warning to Ziusudra is delivered discreetly, through a dream or whispered instruction. It is not announced publicly. This suggests that awareness is selective, not because the message is hidden, but because few are listening in the right way. Preparation becomes an act of trust in pattern rather than proof. The ark is built not on certainty, but on recognition. The biblical narrative emphasizes this same tension. Noah prepares in full view of others who continue their routines. The absence of immediate consequence becomes evidence in their minds that no consequence will come. This misinterpretation of delay is central to the story. Time between warning and event is not reassurance. It is opportunity. Mesoamerican traditions describe survivors who retreat to caves or high ground after interpreting signs in the heavens. These refugees are not chosen randomly. They are selected because memory associates elevation and enclosure with survival. Knowledge of landscape becomes as important as knowledge of sky. The flood is met with strategy, not surrender. Asian flood narratives often extend this interval into generations. Preparations are inherited, not improvised. Water management systems, rituals, and calendrical adjustments accumulate over time, each generation refining the response to inevitable disruption. This implies that floods were expected, not exceptional. Preparation becomes culture. Pacific oral histories preserve detailed instructions for migration, canoe construction, and star navigation, passed down long before displacement is required. These stories function as dormant protocols, activated only when conditions demand. When islands submerge, movement is already encoded into identity. What stands out is that preparation is never framed as resistance. No culture attempts to stop the flood itself. The effort is directed toward continuity, carrying forward what cannot be replaced: seeds, stories, skills, and structures of meaning. The reset is accepted as larger than individual will. This acceptance does not imply passivity. It implies realism. Ancient cultures understood limits. They recognized that some forces operate beyond negotiation. Their response was to align, adapt, and preserve. The flood is destructive, but it is not malicious. It is indifferent. Modern narratives often struggle with this idea. There is an assumption that every challenge can be engineered away, that control is always preferable to adaptation. Ancient flood stories offer a different philosophy. They suggest that survival sometimes requires surrendering the illusion of control in favor of preparedness. When modern observers encounter objects like 3-Eye Atlas, the instinct is to quantify risk, size, speed, trajectory. These questions are valid, but they address only one dimension. The ancient response would have asked a different question. What phase of the cycle does this signal belong to? This shift in questioning changes everything. It moves focus from prediction to readiness, from fear to memory. The appearance of a celestial anomaly becomes a reminder to review inherited knowledge, to examine whether current systems are flexible enough to endure change. Flood myths endure because they encode this interval of awareness. They teach that the most critical moment is not when waters rise, but when signs are first noticed and interpreted. That is where continuity is decided. If humanity has forgotten how to inhabit that interval, then the greatest risk is not the reset itself, but the loss of the quiet, disciplined attentiveness that once allowed survival to pass, deliberately and carefully, from one world into the next. That loss of attentiveness marks the transition from ancient memory into modern uncertainty. As societies grew more complex, reliance on inherited warning narratives gradually diminished. Flood stories became moral lessons, then allegories, then myths detached from lived experience. What was once a practical archive of survival slowly shifted into symbolic storytelling, preserving form but losing urgency. This shift did not erase the pattern, it obscured it. The flood remained, but its role as a recurring reset faded from collective awareness. In many traditions, the event was repositioned as singular, unrepeatable, a one-time judgment, a closed chapter. This reinterpretation offered comfort, but at a cost. It removed the expectation of recurrence, and with it, the discipline of preparedness. Yet traces of the older understanding persist. Archaeology reveals settlements built on elevated ground after certain periods, suggesting learned avoidance of floodplains. Cultural taboos mark regions once submerged. Ritual calendars preserve memory of seasonal instability. These are fragments of a worldview that accepted disruption as cyclical. Modern science, unintentionally, has begun to recover parts of this lost perspective. The study of paleoclimate reveals abrupt transitions rather than smooth curves. The Earth system is not always gradual. It contains thresholds. Once crossed, change accelerates. Flooding, in this context, is not an anomaly. It is a response. This understanding reframes ancient flood narratives as early attempts to document threshold behavior. Without mathematics or models, societies recorded what they observed through story. They noted sequence, sky changes, environmental stress, sudden inundation, displacement, renewal. The precision of this structure suggests careful observation over long periods. The Younger Dryas, often described as a climatic shock, exemplifies this. Temperatures shifted rapidly, ice sheets destabilized, meltwater pulses raised sea levels dramatically. Coastal populations would have experienced this not as abstract data, but as the sudden loss of land. Stories would have formed around these experiences, encoding trauma and survival strategies. What remains unresolved is the role of external triggers. Ancient accounts consistently place the origin of disruption in the sky. Modern research explores impacts, solar variability, and orbital changes as potential contributors to abrupt climate events. The debate continues, but the ancient insistence on looking upward remains consistent. This is why the presence of 3-eye Atlas resonates symbolically, even if its physical effects are negligible. It occupies the narrative position of a sign, not a cause. It reminds modern observers that previous resets were not recognized only in hindsight. They were anticipated by those who paid attention to anomalies. The challenge today is not lack of information, but fragmentation of attention. Data exists, but it is rarely integrated into a coherent sense of cycle. Ancient cultures, for all their limitations, excelled at synthesis. They connected sky, land, society, and time into a single narrative framework. Flood myths, viewed through this lens, are not warnings of doom. They are invitations to remember how humans once oriented themselves within larger systems. They suggest that resets are not failures of nature, but recalibrations that expose the fragility of rigid structures. As this chapter closes, the pattern stands fully visible. Celestial signs, environmental thresholds, floods as resets, survival through preparation and memory. The question that now remains is not whether such cycles exist, but whether modern humanity still possesses the cultural mechanisms to recognize them in time, or whether the stories will remain misunderstood until water, once again, becomes the teacher. That unanswered question opens the next phase of the inquiry, where memory gives way to interpretation. If floods are not isolated catastrophes but expressions of larger cycles, then the task becomes understanding how those cycles operate. Ancient cultures did not describe them with equations or charts, but they returned to the same reference points again and again. Sky, earth, water, and time were treated as a single system, each responding to changes in the others. In many early cosmologies, the heavens were not distant. They were immediate, active, and participatory. Movements of stars and planets were tracked with care, not for curiosity alone, but because they were believed to govern conditions on Earth. Calendars were sacred instruments, aligning agriculture, ritual, and governance with celestial rhythm. When those rhythms faltered, instability followed. The Sumerians organized their understanding of time around repeating cycles governed by divine authority. The Anunnaki were not merely gods, but administrators of order, maintaining balance between realms. When imbalance grew too great, intervention was required. The flood represents one such intervention, restoring symmetry by reducing excess and re-establishing proportion. The reset is not arbitrary. it is corrective. Egyptian tradition echoes this through the concept of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order. Flooding of the Nile was both life-giving and destructive, a controlled reset that renewed fertility. Yet Egyptian texts also speak of primeval floods that preceded creation itself, moments when chaos overwhelmed form before order was restored. These myths preserve the idea that water marks transitions between states of existence. In the Americas, time is explicitly cyclical. Ages begin, flourish, and collapse according to cosmic conditions. The flood is one of several mechanisms through which imbalance is resolved. Importantly, it is never final. Another age always follows. Humanity endures not because it dominates the cycle, but because it adapts to its turning. Asian philosophies develop this idea further. Cycles of creation and dissolution are fundamental. Floods are symptoms of imbalance between opposing forces. When harmony is lost, water overwhelms form. Restoration requires rebalancing, not conquest. This worldview normalizes reset as part of existence rather than an exception. Across these traditions, the flood serves as a visible marker of a deeper recalibration. It is how humans perceive a system correcting itself. The water does not choose. It follows gravity, terrain, and accumulation, yet its timing is framed as meaningful because it coincides with shifts already underway. Modern science approaches similar questions through systems theory. Complex systems can absorb stress up to a point. Beyond that point, they reorganize rapidly. This is not failure, but transition to a new equilibrium. Flooding is a common expression of such transitions, particularly in climate systems influenced by multiple variables. What ancient cultures grasped intuitively is that warning signs appear before thresholds are crossed. Small anomalies accumulate. Patterns become irregular. The attentive notice. The rest adapt only after disruption forces them to. Seen in this light, flood myths become early system narratives. They describe how worlds behave when balance is lost and restored. They teach that continuity depends on flexibility, memory, and respect for limits. As the investigation moves forward, the focus shifts from recounting floods to understanding resets themselves. What triggers them, how often they occur, and whether the signs preserved in ancient memory can still be recognized within a modern framework that has largely forgotten how to listen for them. That shift toward understanding resets brings the discussion closer to theory. If ancient flood narratives reflect real systemic transitions, then they may encode information about frequency, scale, and causation. These stories are not random compilations of fear. They are structured responses to repeated experience, refined across generations to preserve what mattered most. One of the most consistent elements is the idea of recurrence. Floods are remembered as happening before and expected to happen again. This expectation is crucial. It implies that ancient societies did not view their world as static. They anticipated instability as a natural condition. Time was not a straight line, but a loop, occasionally tightening into crisis. This cyclical understanding contrasts sharply with modern assumptions of continuous progress. Ancient cultures measured success not by expansion alone, but by endurance across cycles. The reset was not the end of meaning. It was a test of alignment. Those who survived did so because their systems could bend without breaking. When this framework is applied to environmental evidence, a clearer picture emerges. Climate history reveals oscillations rather than stability. Warm periods end abruptly. Cold periods relax suddenly. Sea levels jump, pause, then stabilize. These patterns suggest that resets are intrinsic to Earth's behavior, not anomalies caused by a single factor. The Younger Dryas, while not the only candidate, exemplifies this behavior. Its onset and termination were rapid, indicating that external triggers may have pushed the system beyond a threshold. Meltwater pulses, ocean circulation changes, or extraterrestrial influences have all been proposed. Regardless of cause, the result was the same: a rapid reorganization of conditions. Ancient observers, experiencing such shifts firsthand, would not have separated cause from effect in modern terms. They recorded sequence. The sky changed, the environment destabilized, water rose. Survival depended on preparation. These steps appear repeatedly, suggesting lived experience rather than invention. This repetition strengthens the reset hypothesis that humanity has encountered global-scale disruptions multiple times, and that flood myths are the narrative residue of those encounters. They function as compressed memory, preserving essential structure while allowing details to adapt to local context. Within this hypothesis, celestial phenomena occupy a key role. Objects entering the inner solar system, shifts in solar output, or orbital variations could all influence climate. Ancient cultures, lacking instrumentation, tracked these through naked-eye observation and mythic interpretation. What they could not quantify, they contextualized. The modern identification of interstellar objects like 3I Atlas reopens this line of thinking. Such objects demonstrate that the solar system is not isolated. External influences are possible. While no direct connection is implied, the conceptual parallel is striking. The sky remains dynamic, not fixed. Flood myths do not argue that every celestial anomaly leads to disaster. They suggest something more nuanced, that certain configurations coincide with instability, that attention to patterns matters more than individual events. As this chapter deepens, the investigation moves from description to implication. If resets are part of a repeating pattern, then the question is no longer whether floods happened, but how often humanity forgets the lessons learned afterward. Each reset erases infrastructure, but it also erases memory. The stories survive, but their context fades. Understanding this erosion of memory may be as important as understanding the resets themselves, because a cycle only becomes dangerous when it is no longer recognized as one, and it is in that forgetting, rather than in water or sky, that the greatest vulnerability may quietly reside. That vulnerability created by forgetting is not accidental. Ancient traditions often suggest that memory fades naturally as stability returns. When the world settles into a new equilibrium, urgency dissolves. What once demanded vigilance becomes background. Flood stories shift from instruction to symbolism, then to legend. The cycle continues, not because it must, but because it is no longer recognized. In many cultures, the generation that survives a reset carries direct knowledge of instability. They remember loss, displacement, and adaptation. But their descendants inherit only fragments, rituals without context, stories without urgency. Over time, the practical lessons embedded in flood myths soften into moral reflections, and preparedness becomes abstract. This erosion of memory explains why resets are experienced as surprises, even when they are not unprecedented. Each cycle resets not only the environment, but the cultural capacity to interpret warning signs. The sky continues to change, but fewer people are trained to notice what those changes once meant. Ancient civilizations attempted to counter this forgetting through monumental architecture, calendars, and sacred texts. These were not only expressions of power or belief, they were memory anchors. Stone outlasted generations. Cycles carved into temples outlasted spoken words. Flood myths were inscribed because speech alone could not carry the weight of warning far enough into the future. Yet even stone erodes, temples collapse, texts are buried, burned, or reinterpreted. Each reset thins the thread of continuity. What remains is pattern without explanation, structure without application. Modern society faces a different version of the same challenge. Information is abundant, but coherence is rare. Data accumulates faster than meaning. Patterns are fragmented across disciplines that rarely speak to one another. Climate science, astronomy, Archaeology and mythology exist in parallel, seldom integrated into a unified narrative of cycles. This fragmentation mirrors the ancient loss of synthesis. Where earlier cultures connected sky, land, and society, modern thought often isolates variables. Floods become climate events. Celestial anomalies become astronomical curiosities. The connective tissue that once framed these as related phases of a single process is largely absent. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas highlights this gap. Scientifically, it is categorized and contextualized. Culturally, it resonates in a different register. It evokes ancient reflexes that modern frameworks struggle to accommodate. The question it raises is not what it will do, but what it represents in the long memory of human response to the sky. Flood myths survive precisely because they resist fragmentation. They compress complex relationships into narrative form. Sky signals, environmental thresholds, human preparedness, and renewal are bound together in a way that is difficult to separate. This is why they continue to resurface whenever instability becomes visible. If resets are inevitable features of complex systems, then the true challenge lies in preserving interpretive capacity across generations. Not just records of what happened, but understanding of how to recognize the sequence before it completes itself. As this exploration continues, the focus turns toward whether modern humanity can reconstruct that lost synthesis, whether ancient memory can be translated into contemporary awareness, or whether the cycle will proceed once more with the signs visible, the stories remembered, and the deeper meaning once again allowed to fade into silence. That fading of meaning creates a paradox. The more advanced a civilization becomes, the more distant its memory of instability grows. Comfort replaces caution. Predictability becomes assumed. Flood myths remain, but they are treated as artifacts of a less informed age rather than as compressed records of lived experience. In forgetting the function of these stories, societies lose an essential form of orientation. Ancient cultures understood that knowledge alone was not enough. What mattered was continuity of attention. Calendars were adjusted, rituals repeated, and myths retold, not because people believed the world would end, but because they believed it could change quickly. These practices kept awareness active even during long periods of calm. When that awareness erodes, resets feel sudden. The warning phase still exists, but it goes unrecognized. Signs appear in the sky, shifts occur in climate, patterns drift slightly off course. Individually, these signals seem insignificant. Together, they indicate a system approaching threshold. Ancient narratives insist that this aggregation matters. Modern frameworks excel at analyzing isolated variables, temperature trends, orbital mechanics, ocean circulation. Yet the ability to integrate these into a lived sense of sequence is limited. The result is a gap between detection and response. Data accumulates, but cultural readiness does not. This is where the idea of a global reset becomes difficult to discuss without distortion. The term suggests abrupt collapse, yet ancient memory frames it as reorganization. The flood removes what can no longer be sustained and reveals a new configuration beneath. It is violent, but it is also clarifying. Survivors in ancient stories are not described as superior. They are attentive. They recognize pattern before consensus forms. They prepare quietly, often misunderstood by their peers. Their success lies not in certainty, but in responsiveness. The reappearance of interstellar objects like Three-Eye Atlas does not validate ancient myths, nor does it predict future catastrophe. Its relevance lies elsewhere. It reminds modern observers that the sky is dynamic, that external influences exist, and that humanity has historically associated unusual celestial behavior with periods of transformation. Flood myths persist because they address this uncertainty without demanding precision. They teach posture rather than prediction. When signs appear, slow down, compare, preserve, prepare. As the investigation moves forward, the central question sharpens. Can modern society recover the kind of integrative awareness that ancient cultures maintained through story? Or has complexity outpaced memory, leaving humanity informed but unprepared, as cycles continue to unfold beyond the horizon of immediate concern? That question lingers because it challenges modern assumptions about progress. If awareness diminishes as systems grow more complex, then advancement alone does not guarantee resilience. Ancient flood narratives repeatedly warn that sophistication can coexist with fragility. In fact, the two often rise together. In many traditions, the societies that fall to floods are not primitive. They are organized, productive, and confident. Infrastructure is extensive. Knowledge is specialized. Yet this specialization fragments responsibility. No single group watches the whole pattern. Each watches a part. When the system shifts, no one sees it soon enough. Ancient cultures attempted to counter this through myth. Story functioned as a unifying framework, connecting domains that would otherwise remain separate. Sky movements, seasonal changes, social order, and moral behavior were woven into a single narrative thread. Flood myths are not scientific reports, but integrative models. Modern thought often resists this approach. Myth is dismissed as symbolic, science as literal. But ancient narratives were not concerned with that distinction. They sought coherence. They preserved relationships rather than measurements. This allowed them to transmit system-level awareness across generations without technical language. The reset hypothesis gains strength in this context. Floods become expressions of systemic overload, not isolated failures. When complexity exceeds adaptability, reorganization follows. Water is one of the most efficient agents of this process. It moves without intention, redistributing matter according to new constraints. Evidence of repeated coastal abandonment supports this view. Archaeological sites submerged beneath modern seas suggest that early populations were displaced multiple times. Each displacement would have reinforced memory of instability until long periods of calm allowed that memory to fade. The challenge for modern society is scale. Today's systems are global. A reset would not be regional. The interdependence that brings efficiency also amplifies disruption. Ancient floods transformed landscapes. Modern resets would transform networks. This makes the preservation of integrative narratives more important than ever. Data without synthesis cannot guide preparation. Awareness must be cultural, not just technical. Objects like 3i Atlas serve as reminders of this need. They interrupt routine. They draw attention outward. For ancient observers, such interruptions were moments to review stories, to reassess alignment with larger cycles. Flood myths remain relevant not because they predict outcomes, but because they preserve orientation. They remind humanity that stability is conditional, that warning phases exist, and that survival favors those who recognize sequence over those who trust permanence. As this exploration continues, the focus will shift toward whether modern frameworks can be reoriented to recover this lost coherence, whether ancient stories can inform contemporary resilience, or whether the cycle will proceed once more with knowledge abundant, but wisdom fragmented across disciplines that no longer speak the same language. That fragmentation of wisdom becomes most visible when examining how modern society interprets risk. Threats are assessed statistically, isolated from narrative continuity. Probability replaces pattern. Yet ancient flood traditions rarely focus on likelihood. They focus on timing, sequence, and consequence. The question is not if disruption is possible, but how societies behave when signals accumulate. In ancient memory, the sky functions as an early indicator, not because it causes every reset, but because it changes first. Celestial irregularities draw attention precisely because they operate beyond human control. They remind observers that the system includes variables outside local influence. Modern astronomy has confirmed this instability. The solar system is not a closed environment. Objects enter and leave. Solar output fluctuates. Orbital cycles shift over long durations. None of this implies catastrophe, but it reinforces a truth ancient cultures accepted intuitively. External forces exist, and they matter. Flood myths encode this awareness through symbolism. Gods convene, suns fail, stars wander. These images reflect attempts to describe systemic imbalance in accessible terms. The flood that follows is the physical expression of that imbalance, translated into human experience. The reset hypothesis does not require every myth to be literal. It requires only that repeated patterns reflect repeated encounters with instability. When stories across continents describe the same sequence, it suggests shared observation, not shared imagination. Modern resistance to this idea often stems from discomfort with uncertainty. Cyclical models challenge linear narratives of progress. They imply that collapse is not failure, but phase, that continuity requires humility. This humility is present in flood survivors. They do not claim mastery over the world. They inherit responsibility. Their task is to carry forward what remains valuable, not to rebuild the past exactly as it was. The relevance of 3i Atlas within this framework remains symbolic, not predictive. It represents a reminder of attentiveness, a prompt to revisit long-term patterns rather than immediate conclusions. Flood myths endure because they teach restraint. They suggest that the most dangerous posture is certainty during stability. When everything appears controlled, awareness dulls. That is when thresholds are crossed unnoticed. As this chapter unfolds, the inquiry approaches its core, not whether floods happened, but whether humanity still understands how to live within systems that periodically reset. Whether modern civilization can accept limits without fear and preparedness without panic. The ancient answer was neither optimism nor despair. It was patience, observation, and the quiet passing of memory forward, in the hope that when signs appeared again, someone, somewhere, would still recognize what they meant. That quiet passing of memory is the thread now most at risk. Ancient cultures assumed that instability was part of existence, and so they designed their identities around endurance rather than permanence. Cities were important, but stories were essential. What survived a flood was not stone alone, but orientation, a sense of how to begin again without losing coherence. In this way, flood myths functioned as inheritance. They were not warnings shouted at the future, but reminders carried gently forward. Each retelling reaffirmed that the world had changed before and would change again. The goal was not to prevent transformation, but to survive it without losing meaning. Modern civilization has inherited the stories, but not always the posture behind them. The myths remain, yet they are often treated as metaphors detached from real-world processes. This separation weakens their function. Without context, memory becomes entertainment rather than guidance. What ancient societies feared most was not destruction, but disorientation, a reset that erased not only land and structures, but understanding itself. That is why survivors are always portrayed as keepers of knowledge. They remember names, measures, cycles. They reintroduce order slowly, aware that rushing reconstruction invites repetition of the same imbalance. This emphasis on restraint contrasts sharply with modern recovery narratives, which prioritize rapid restoration. The ancient approach accepted that the world after a reset was not the same world as before. Adaptation required patience, not replication. Seen through this lens, floods were moments of enforced humility. They stripped away excess and revealed underlying dependencies. Human systems were reminded that they rested within larger natural systems, not above them. The reemergence of interest in global resets reflects a subtle cultural unease. As modern systems grow more interconnected, their fragility becomes harder to ignore. Climate volatility, ecological strain, and celestial discoveries converge into a sense that stability may be conditional rather than guaranteed. 3i Atlas enters this moment as a symbol of that unease. It does not threaten, but it disrupts assumption. It reminds observers that the sky is active, that the broader environment includes forces beyond immediate prediction. Flood myths speak directly to this realization. They tell us that uncertainty is not new, and that survival has always depended on how societies relate to it. Those who acknowledged limits endured. Those who assumed permanence were surprised. As the narrative continues, attention turns toward the future-facing implications of this ancient wisdom. If resets are recurring, then preparedness must be cultural, not reactive. Memory must be renewed, not archived. The flood, in this sense, is not only a story of water, it is a story about remembering how to remain human when the structures that define normal life are temporarily swept away, and the world asks, quietly and without malice, to be rebalanced once again. That call for remembrance leads naturally into the question of responsibility. Ancient flood narratives do not place blame on individuals alone, but on collective imbalance. The reset occurs when systems drift too far from sustainability, when accumulation outpaces awareness. Responsibility, therefore, is shared, and survival depends on collective adaptation. In these stories, those who endure are not saviors, they are stewards. Their task after the flood is not domination, but guidance. They reintroduce practices that restore balance, often limiting expansion, reinforcing cycles, and emphasizing restraint. The post-reset world is smaller, quieter, and more cautious. This caution is not weakness. It is an acknowledgement of vulnerability. Ancient societies understood that excess invites correction. Floods were reminders that boundaries exist, even when invisible. Ignoring them did not delay the reset. It ensured it would be harsher. Modern civilization rarely frames responsibility in this way. Environmental strain is often discussed in technical terms, detached from cultural posture. Yet ancient narratives insist that behavior and environment are inseparable. When societies lose proportion, the system responds. This perspective reframes the idea of warning. Signs are not punishments, they are feedback. The sky changes, the climate shifts, the land responds. These are signals within a living system, not external attacks. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas can be understood within this logic. It is not an omen of destruction, but a reminder of context, a cue to widen perspective and consider long-term cycles rather than immediate reassurance. Flood myths endure because they preserve this system's view. They teach that survival is not about predicting exact outcomes, but about aligning behavior with limits. Preparation is ethical as much as practical. As this chapter deepens, the inquiry turns toward whether modern society can recover this sense of shared responsibility, whether awareness can become collective rather than specialized, or whether the next reset, whenever it comes, will once again expose the cost of forgetting that stability is a condition to be maintained, not a guarantee to be assumed. That shared responsibility becomes more difficult to maintain as societies grow in scale. Ancient communities were small enough that environmental feedback was immediate and visible. A failed harvest, rising water, or shifting season could be felt directly. Memory was reinforced by experience. In larger systems, distance dilutes consequence. Flood myths attempt to bridge that distance. They compress generations of experience into a single narrative, making long-term feedback emotionally accessible. By telling the story of a world reset, they remind listeners that actions accumulate beyond individual lifetimes. Modern systems, however, operate on delayed feedback. Cause and effect are separated by time and geography. This makes early signals easier to ignore. When thresholds are finally crossed, response feels sudden, even though the process has been unfolding quietly for years. Ancient cultures anticipated this problem. They embedded limits into ritual and law, reinforcing restraint even during abundance. Flood stories reinforced why such limits mattered. They framed excess not as success, but as imbalance. The loss of these narrative constraints leaves modern society vulnerable. Without shared stories that connect behavior to consequence, responsibility fragments. Each sector optimizes locally, while the system drifts globally. The relevance of celestial signs within this framework becomes clearer. They function as global signals, visible to all, transcending borders. When the sky behaves unexpectedly, it invites collective attention. Ancient societies used these moments to realign calendars, rituals, and priorities. 3i Atlas occupies this symbolic space. It does not demand action. It invites reflection. It reminds humanity that the environment includes dimensions beyond immediate control, and that humility is an adaptive strategy. Flood myths persist because they model this humility. They show societies responding to instability not with denial, but with preparation. Survivors act before consensus forms, guided by memory rather than proof. As this exploration continues, the focus shifts toward integration. Whether modern humanity can reconstruct shared narratives that connect sky, land, and society, or whether specialization has fragmented awareness beyond repair, the ancient stories offer no guarantees. They offer orientation. They suggest that the capacity to recognize pattern, to accept limits, and to act with restraint may be the difference between continuity and surprise when the waters, once again, begin to rise. That question of integration touches the core tension between ancient wisdom and modern capability. Humanity today possesses unprecedented tools for observation, yet often lacks a unifying framework to interpret what is seen. Information accumulates faster than meaning, and without narrative coherence, signals lose their impact. Ancient flood myths solved this problem through simplicity. They reduced complexity to sequence. Something changes in the sky. The environment destabilizes. Water rises. Survivors preserve what matters. A new order emerges. This structure allowed societies to remember process without needing precision. Modern culture tends to distrust such compression. It favors detail over pattern. Yet detail alone does not guide behavior. Ancient stories endured because they offered guidance under uncertainty, not exact prediction. The reset hypothesis aligns with this approach. It does not claim inevitability or timeline. It proposes that complex systems periodically reorganize and that floods are one expression of this process. The value lies not in certainty, but in preparedness. Within this view, celestial phenomena regain narrative importance. They are not causes in isolation, but components of a larger system. Changes above can coincide with changes below, amplifying instability. Ancient observers recorded this relationship because it was visible, not because it was mystical. 3i Atlas, observed and measured, exemplifies this continuity of observation. Its scientific classification does not erase its symbolic resonance. It reminds humanity that the sky remains active and that long-term patterns extend beyond immediate horizons. Flood myths do not ask listeners to fear the future. They ask them to respect cycles. They suggest that survival favors those who remain attentive even during long periods of calm. As the narrative moves forward, attention turns toward legacy. What kind of memory will modern society pass forward? Data without story, or story informed by data? The ancient answer was clear. Memory must be carried in forms that endure beyond infrastructure. When water removes the surface, only what is deeply embedded survives. Whether modern humanity can embed awareness deeply enough remains uncertain, but the stories persist, quietly insisting that the world has reset before, and that understanding how to listen may matter more than knowing exactly when. That uncertainty about legacy brings the investigation toward its most reflective phase. Flood myths are not forecasts. They are mirrors, held up to each generation in turn. What they reveal depends on how willing a society is to see itself within a longer cycle rather than at its center. Ancient cultures did not view resets as failures of morality alone. They saw them as failures of proportion. When growth outpaced balance, correction followed. This framing shifts attention away from blame and toward relationship. How humans relate to land, water, time, and sky. Modern civilization often treats these elements as resources rather than relationships. This distinction matters. When systems are seen only as inputs, limits are approached without awareness. Ancient narratives insist that limits announce themselves, but only to those listening. Flood survivors are portrayed as listeners. They notice subtle changes. They trust inherited memory even when present conditions feel stable. Their actions seem unnecessary until they become essential. The symbolic power of Three-Eye Atlas lies here. It is not what the object will do, but what it prompts. It invites comparison. It reopens old questions about cycles, thresholds, and humanity's place within a dynamic system. Flood myths endure because they encourage this comparison. They remind societies that stability is temporary and that renewal often arrives through disruption rather than planning. As this chapter nears its close, the focus turns inward. Preparedness is not only technical, it is cultural. It depends on shared understanding, restraint, and willingness to accept that not all change can be prevented. Ancient wisdom did not promise safety. It promised continuity through awareness. The flood would come, in one form or another, but meaning could survive if memory did. The final movement of this narrative will turn toward that inheritance, what it means to carry memory forward in a world that prefers immediacy, and whether the quiet lessons of ancient floods can still shape response before the next reset completes its cycle, unseen until it is already underway. That inheritance of memory marks the threshold between observation and responsibility. Ancient flood narratives do not end with survival alone. They end with obligation. Those who endure carry more than relief. They carry the duty to remember, to teach, and to restrain future excess. Survival without memory is temporary. Continuity requires transmission. In many traditions, the post-flood world begins cautiously. Expansion is slow. Boundaries are respected. The survivors understand that the conditions supporting life have changed. They rebuild with awareness of limits, knowing that ignoring those limits invites repetition. This restraint is not pessimism, it is maturity. Over time, however, memory softens. New generations inherit a stable world, but not the experience that shaped it. The lessons remain encoded in story, but their urgency fades. What was once instruction becomes tradition, then symbolism, then myth. The cycle quietly resets again. Modern society stands deep within this forgetting phase. Technical knowledge is immense, yet cultural memory of systemic vulnerability is thin. Disruption is treated as anomaly rather than phase. Floods are disasters, not signals. Celestial events are curiosities, not prompts for reflection. This is why ancient narratives remain relevant. They do not compete with science. They complement it by preserving orientation. They remind humanity that not all knowledge is predictive. Some knowledge is preparatory. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas sits within this tension. It does not announce a reset. It reminds observers that the sky is part of the system and that external factors have always played a role in Earth's history. It invites humility, not alarm. Flood myths suggest that the most dangerous moment is not collapse, but complacency. When systems appear stable, attention drifts. When attention drifts, thresholds are crossed unnoticed. As this chapter closes, the pattern stands complete. Celestial signs draw awareness. Environmental systems respond. Floods reset conditions. Survivors preserve memory. Over time, memory fades. The cycle resumes. What remains unresolved is whether modern humanity can interrupt this forgetting, whether awareness can be sustained without crisis, whether ancient wisdom can be integrated into contemporary life before it is forced upon it again. The stories do not demand belief. They ask for attentiveness. They whisper that the world has changed before, that it will change again, and that the difference between continuity and surprise lies not in prediction, but in remembering how to listen when the signs quietly return. That quiet return of signs marks the transition from memory into consequence. Ancient flood narratives suggest that once awareness fades completely, the system moves without resistance. The reset no longer waits for understanding. It proceeds according to forces already set in motion. This is where catastrophe enters the story, not as chaos, but as inevitability. Floods arrive when adaptation is no longer gradual. When thresholds are crossed, change accelerates beyond negotiation. Water moves faster than culture can respond. Landscapes are redrawn in days or weeks rather than generations. In many traditions, this phase is described with restraint. There is no spectacle, no prolonged drama. The flood is swift, overwhelming, and impersonal. This tone matters. It reflects acceptance rather than outrage. The reset is not framed as cruelty, but as consequence. Ancient accounts emphasize loss without excess detail. Cities disappear, lineages end. Familiar ground becomes unreachable. What survives does so because it was already positioned for transition. High ground, mobility, and preserved knowledge determine outcome more than strength or status. Modern parallels are increasingly visible. Rapid sea level rise, extreme weather, and sudden displacement echo ancient descriptions of abrupt change. The difference is scale. Today, disruption affects interconnected systems simultaneously. Infrastructure, supply chains, and social order are tightly coupled. A reset would cascade quickly. This amplifies the importance of the warning phase. Once the reset begins, options narrow. Ancient stories stress that preparation must occur before consensus. Waiting for certainty ensures vulnerability. The idea of cosmic involvement returns here. Flood myths often describe the sky closing or opening, as if a larger system completes its cycle. Whether interpreted symbolically or physically, this reinforces the sense that resets are not local accidents. They reflect alignment shifts beyond human control. 3i Atlas, in this context, remains a reminder rather than a trigger. Its significance lies in timing. It appears during a period of global complexity and environmental strain, echoing moments preserved in ancient memory when attention should have sharpened. As this narrative enters the phase of catastrophe and reset, the tone remains calm. Ancient wisdom did not dwell on fear. It focused on clarity. When change becomes unavoidable, panic is wasted energy. Orientation is everything. The next movement will examine how resets unfold across the planet, and how humanity, fragmented yet connected, responds when water becomes the final messenger of imbalance, carrying the lesson forward whether it is welcomed or not. That moment when change becomes unavoidable reshapes everything that follows. Ancient flood narratives describe a world no longer governed by intention, but by momentum. Once the waters begin to rise, the window for debate closes. What remains is response, movement, endurance. In these accounts, the flood is not instantaneous. It unfolds in stages. First, familiar boundaries dissolve, rivers overflow, coastlines retreat, and markers of ownership vanish beneath water. This gradual erasure destabilizes identity itself. When land disappears, so do the assumptions built upon it. Communities fracture as survival demands mobility. Some flee toward higher ground. Others are trapped by geography or delay. Ancient stories remember this divergence without judgment. Survival is situational. Preparation and position matter more than virtue. The water continues to rise until a new equilibrium is forced. Ecosystems collapse and reorganize. Species vanish locally while others migrate. Human populations thin, leaving gaps in memory that will later be filled with myth. What remains visible after the flood is only a fraction of what existed before. Modern science confirms that such rapid transformations have occurred. Meltwater pulses raised sea levels dramatically within short spans of time. Entire regions were submerged, reshaping migration routes and isolating survivors. These were not gradual adjustments. They were shocks. Ancient observers experienced these shocks without explanation, yet they recognized pattern. The flood was not an anomaly, it was a phase, a passage between worlds. As the water recedes, the survivors emerge into unfamiliar terrain. The landscape is altered, old paths are gone. What was once center becomes margin. The reset is complete not when the flood peaks, but when it withdraws, revealing a world that demands reinterpretation. This is the threshold where memory either survives or dissolves. Those who remember the sequence can adapt. Those who do not must rebuild blindly. The flood, in this sense, is not the end of civilization. It is the end of continuity for those unprepared. For the rest, it marks the beginning of a quieter, more constrained world, shaped by loss, but guided by hard-earned awareness of limits that can no longer be ignored. That quieter world emerges slowly, almost hesitantly. Ancient flood stories describe the aftermath not as triumph, but as careful assessment. Survivors step into open air with uncertainty, unsure which rules still apply. The world looks familiar, yet behaves differently. Rivers follow new paths. Coastlines are reshaped. What was once reliable must be relearned. Reconstruction begins with observation rather than ambition. Survivors test the land, watch the sky, and measure seasons anew. This patience reflects an understanding that the old order no longer exists. To rebuild too quickly would be to repeat the imbalance that led to the reset. In many traditions, the first acts after the flood involve naming. Animals are counted. Directions are reestablished. Time is recalibrated. These acts restore orientation. They allow humans to situate themselves within altered systems without assuming mastery over them. This phase highlights a crucial lesson preserved across cultures. The reset does not demand immediate progress. It demands comprehension. Survival depends on recognizing how conditions have changed and adjusting behavior accordingly. Modern parallels can be seen in regions recovering from environmental catastrophe. When landscapes shift rapidly, old infrastructure fails. New patterns must be learned. The instinct to restore what was lost often clashes with the reality that the environment will no longer support it. Ancient narratives caution against nostalgia. They emphasize adaptation. The survivors who endure are those willing to let go of previous assumptions. The flood strips away not only structures, but certainty. Memory plays a central role here. Those who remember the warning signs understand that stability is conditional. They teach restraint to the next generation, embedding caution into culture. Yet even in this careful phase, forgetting begins. As time passes and the waters become distant memory, urgency fades. The lessons remain, but their emotional weight diminishes. Children inherit a stable world, not the fear that shaped it. This is how the cycle prepares to repeat. The reset restores balance temporarily, but memory erodes. The new world grows confident. Boundaries are tested. The same questions return, quietly, beneath the surface of renewed stability. Flood myths preserve this entire arc. Not just destruction, but recovery and forgetting. They remind us that the most fragile phase of any reset is not collapse, but renewal. When comfort returns and the conditions for imbalance begin once again to form. That return of comfort marks the slow turning of the cycle toward repetition. Ancient traditions are clear that forgetting is not a failure of intelligence, but a natural outcome of stability. When survival is no longer uncertain, vigilance relaxes. The lessons of the flood remain, but they are no longer felt in the body. In post-flood generations, growth resumes. Settlements expand. Trade networks form. New technologies appear. The memory of constraint gives way to confidence. This transition is remembered with subtle caution in ancient texts, as though the storytellers understood how easily balance can be lost again. The survivors attempt to preserve restraint through law and ritual. Boundaries are codified. Taboos emerge around certain landscapes, often floodplains or coasts once submerged. These cultural limits are not arbitrary. They are attempts to freeze memory into practice. Over time, however, these practices become tradition rather than necessity. The reason behind them fades. What remains is form without context. When conditions change once more, the warning embedded in ritual is no longer recognized. Archaeology supports this pattern. Many ancient settlements were rebuilt repeatedly on vulnerable ground. Despite evidence of previous inundation, each generation weighed short-term benefit against long-term risk, often choosing expansion over caution. This is not ignorance. It is optimism shaped by experience of stability. When disasters are distant, risk feels abstract. Ancient flood myths capture this psychology with remarkable precision. The flood in these stories is never the result of a single decision. It is the culmination of many small choices made under the assumption that conditions will remain favorable. By the time danger becomes visible, options have narrowed. Modern society exhibits similar tendencies. Development continues in exposed regions. Systems grow denser and more efficient, but also more fragile. The memory of disruption exists, yet it competes with incentives that reward short-term stability. Flood myths endure because they do not blame this behavior. They describe it. They show how confidence accumulates quietly until it becomes indistinguishable from inevitability. As this chapter unfolds, the narrative moves toward interpretation. If forgetting is part of the cycle, then awareness must be actively renewed. Memory cannot be preserved passively. It must be revisited, reinterpreted, and re-embedded into culture before the next reset reveals, once again, the cost of assuming permanence in a world shaped by change. That need to renew awareness brings the narrative into a more interpretive space. Ancient flood myths were not only records of past events, they were tools designed to interrupt forgetting. By retelling the story, each generation was invited to re-enter the moment of warning, to feel uncertainty before it returned. These myths functioned as cultural checkpoints. They reminded societies that stability is conditional and that cycles operate beyond human preference. The flood was a reference point, a marker against which present behavior could be measured. Over time, however, interpretation shifted. Stories once understood as cyclical became fixed as singular events. This shift reduced their practical value. If the flood happened only once, it no longer demanded vigilance. Memory lost its forward-facing role. This reinterpretation is visible across cultures. What were once recurring ages became linear histories. Resets became origins. The past was sealed, and the future assumed continuity. This narrative comfort came at the cost of preparedness. Modern frameworks often reinforce this linearity. Progress is expected. Collapse is treated as deviation. Yet environmental and archaeological evidence continues to suggest episodic disruption. The tension between expectation and reality grows. Flood myths persist because they resist this linear comfort. They insist on recurrence, even when reinterpreted. The presence of multiple flood traditions across cultures quietly undermines the idea of singular catastrophe. The reset hypothesis aligns with this resistance. It reframes floods as systemic responses to accumulated imbalance rather than isolated failures. In this view, memory is not about what happened, but about what tends to happen under certain conditions. 3i Atlas fits into this interpretive layer not as proof, but as prompt. It invites reconsideration of cycles, external influences, and humanity's long relationship with an unpredictable sky. The value of this prompt lies in its timing. It appears during an era of global strain, when environmental systems are approaching known thresholds. Ancient cultures would have seen this as a moment for review, not reaction. As the investigation continues, the focus shifts toward whether modern society can reclaim the function of myth without abandoning reason, whether narrative and data can converge into a renewed form of preparedness. The flood stories do not ask to be believed literally. They ask to be understood structurally. They ask whether humanity can recognize when conditions resemble earlier turning points, and whether that recognition can still influence behavior before the cycle completes itself once more. That convergence of narrative and data represents a crossroads. Ancient societies relied on story because it carried pattern through time. Modern societies rely on measurement, yet often struggle to carry meaning forward with the same durability. The challenge is not choosing one over the other, but allowing them to inform each other. Flood myths illustrate how this balance once worked. Observation generated story, story preserved sequence, sequence guided behavior. The system was imperfect, but it sustained awareness across generations without requiring constant rediscovery. Memory was communal. Today, observation is precise but fragmented. Knowledge is specialized, stored in formats that require context to interpret. Without shared narrative, signals lose cohesion. A warning in one domain fails to translate into action in another. The reset hypothesis suggests that this fragmentation itself increases vulnerability. When systems are tightly coupled, failure in one propagates quickly. Resilience depends on integration. Ancient myths provided that integration by linking sky, earth, and society into a single frame. Within this frame, floods were not feared as random destruction. They were understood as expressions of imbalance. The lesson was not to predict the next flood, but to remain aligned with conditions that delayed it. Three-Eye Atlas, viewed through this lens, is less an object of concern than a reminder of relationship. It represents the continued openness of the system. The sky is not sealed off. External influences exist. Awareness must extend beyond the immediate horizon. Flood myths persist because they encode this openness. They caution against assuming control over complex systems. They suggest that humility, adaptability, and memory are more reliable defenses than certainty. As the narrative approaches its final movement, attention turns toward synthesis. How ancient patterns, modern science, and present signals might coexist within a renewed cultural posture. The stories do not predict collapse, they predict forgetting, and they offer a quiet solution: to remember sequence, to notice accumulation, to act before momentum replaces choice. In this sense, the flood is not the enemy, it is the teacher, and the lesson it repeats, across cultures and centuries, is simple. Stability is temporary, awareness is renewable, and survival, in the deepest sense, belongs to those who remember how to listen before the water begins to speak. That lesson carried by the flood leads into the final phase of interpretation, where ancient memory meets present responsibility. If resets are recurring features of complex systems, then the most important question is not when the next one occurs, but how societies position themselves within inevitability. Ancient cultures did not seek to escape cycles. They sought to live in rhythm with them. This required acceptance of limits and willingness to release what could not endure. Flood myths preserve this posture with remarkable consistency. They teach that continuity is achieved not by resisting change, but by anticipating it. In these stories, loss is never total. Something always passes through the reset. Seeds, knowledge, orientation. What survives is not excess, but essence. This distinction matters. It implies that resilience depends on discernment. Knowing what to preserve matters more than knowing how to protect everything. Modern society often pursues total preservation. Infrastructure, growth systems are defended as if permanence were possible. Ancient wisdom offers a different approach. It suggests that selective continuity is healthier than absolute control. The symbolic power of Three-Eye Atlas returns here one last time. Its passage through the inner solar system is brief, but its meaning lingers. It reminds humanity that the environment is larger than immediate concerns, and that attention must sometimes widen rather than narrow. Flood myths endure because they offer a calm response to uncertainty. They do not demand urgency without reason. They encourage observation, preparation, and humility. When thresholds are crossed, panic gives way to acceptance. As the narrative moves toward closure, the emphasis shifts from catastrophe to inheritance. What matters most is not whether a reset occurs, but what is carried forward when it does. The ancient stories suggest that humanity has faced these moments before and survived by remembering sequence rather than outcome. They invite modern listeners to do the same, to step back from immediacy, to notice patterns forming quietly, and to consider what knowledge, values, and structures deserve passage into whatever world emerges next. The cycle does not end, it turns, and with each turn, the opportunity to remember returns. Waiting patiently for those willing to listen before change speaks louder than memory ever could. That turning of the cycle brings the narrative into its most reflective space. Ancient flood myths do not resolve tension. They leave it suspended, reminding listeners that awareness is an ongoing practice, not a conclusion. The world does not move toward final stability. It oscillates, responding to pressures seen and unseen. In this view, humanity is neither victim nor master. It is participant. The flood is not an enemy to defeat, but a signal that participation has drifted out of balance. When systems exceed their limits, correction follows, indifferent to intention. Ancient cultures accepted this indifference. They understood that the natural world does not negotiate. Rivers follow gravity. Seas respond to accumulation. The sky moves according to cycles far older than human memory. Respecting these realities was not resignation, it was wisdom. What distinguishes cultures that endured was not power, but alignment. They built lightly, preserved knowledge carefully, and remained attentive to change. Their stories were not predictions. They were calibrations, helping each generation sense when balance was slipping. Modern society often struggles with this posture. Control is prioritized over alignment, speed over patience, expansion over restraint. Flood myths challenge these instincts quietly, without confrontation. They suggest that sustainability emerges from listening rather than commanding. The presence of Three-Eye Atlas, fleeting and distant, underscores this lesson. It passes without drama, yet it reaffirms that the sky remains dynamic, that humanity exists within a broader system, not at its center. As this chapter settles, the reset is no longer framed as catastrophe. It becomes context, a reminder that change is inherent and that continuity depends on how societies respond long before thresholds are crossed. The ancient stories do not promise safety, they promise perspective. They remind us that the world has changed before, that it will change again, and that the space between stability and disruption is where meaning is decided. In that space, memory matters, attention matters, the willingness to adapt matters. The flood recedes not only from the land but from consciousness, and yet its lesson remains, quietly embedded in story, waiting for the moment when the cycle turns again and humanity must decide, once more, whether it remembers how to listen. That decision to remember marks the beginning of interpretation rather than reaction. Ancient cultures did not stop at describing floods. They asked what the pattern meant, why water returned, why survival depended on awareness rather than strength. From these questions emerged theory, expressed through myth rather than calculation. Floods were understood as corrections within a larger rhythm. When imbalance accumulated, the system reasserted proportion. Water, adaptable and pervasive, became the agent of this correction. It reached everywhere excess had spread. Nothing rigid survived unchanged. This interpretation reframes catastrophe as feedback. The world responds when limits are crossed. Ancient stories insist that this response is not personal. It is structural. The flood arrives because conditions allow it, not because a judgment is issued. Modern systems theory echoes this insight. Complex systems absorb stress until thresholds are reached. Beyond those points, reorganization is rapid and often irreversible. Flooding is a common expression of such phase shifts, particularly in climate systems influenced by external and internal variables. Ancient observers lacked terminology, but they recognized behavior. They noted that change clustered, that long, calm periods ended abruptly, that resets followed recognizable sequences. These observations were preserved because they mattered. Within this framework, celestial events regain relevance, not as causes in isolation, but as contributors to systemic stress. Changes in solar behavior, orbital dynamics, or external debris could tip already strained systems into transition. Ancient cultures watched the sky because it signaled shifts beyond local control. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas aligns symbolically with this interpretive tradition. It reminds modern observers that the system remains open, that influences are not confined to Earth alone, that cycles operate on scales larger than planning horizons. Flood myths endure because they preserve this system's awareness. They teach that stability is conditional, that resilience requires flexibility, and that preparedness begins with recognizing when patterns repeat. Interpretation, then, is not about proving the past. It is about understanding the present within a longer rhythm. The ancient lesson is clear. When signs resemble earlier turning points, attention must sharpen, not because disaster is certain, but because the system may be approaching a phase where choice gives way to momentum once again. That momentum, once established, reshapes interpretation into inevitability. Ancient narratives consistently describe a point of no return, a moment when conditions no longer respond to adjustment. From that threshold forward, events unfold according to forces already set in motion. Flood myths place this threshold before the water rises. The decisive moment occurs when warnings are dismissed, when imbalance is normalized, and when delay is mistaken for safety. By the time destruction is visible, the sequence is complete. This idea challenges modern assumptions about control. Intervention is often imagined as possible at any stage. Ancient memory suggests otherwise. Some processes cannot be reversed once acceleration begins. Preparedness must precede consensus. In mythic language, this threshold is described as the closing of the sky or the sealing of fate. In systemic terms, it represents loss of flexibility. The system reorganizes because it must. Modern science recognizes similar behavior. Ice sheets destabilize rapidly once critical temperatures are crossed. Ocean circulation shifts abruptly when freshwater input overwhelms balance. These are not gradual changes. They are phase transitions. Ancient flood stories encode this understanding without data. They preserve sequence, warning, delay, threshold, flood, renewal. This consistency across cultures suggests lived recognition of non-linear change. The relevance of this insight today is not speculative. Global systems show signs of strain. Environmental, technological, and social networks are tightly coupled. Small disruptions propagate widely. Threshold behavior is no longer theoretical. Within this context, objects like Three-Eye Atlas serve as reminders of scale. They place human systems within a broader cosmic environment. They challenge the assumption that conditions remain static simply because they have been stable within recent memory. Flood myths do not argue that collapse is imminent. They argue that systems must be understood as dynamic, that vigilance is required even during calm periods. The ancient warning is subtle. Do not confuse delay with safety. Do not assume reversibility where none exists. And do not wait for certainty when sequence has already been observed before. Once momentum replaces choice, the reset proceeds without regard for belief. The only remaining difference lies in what survives through it. That question of survival brings interpretation to its most practical conclusion. Ancient flood myths are ultimately not about destruction. They are about continuity under constraint. What persists when excess is removed. What adapts when conditions change. Survivors are never portrayed as those who saved everything. They saved essentials, seeds, skills, memory, and orientation. This selectivity is deliberate. It reflects an understanding that preservation without discernment recreates imbalance. Modern society often struggles with this idea. The instinct is to preserve systems in their entirety. Infrastructure, growth, and complexity are defended as if all were equally necessary. Ancient wisdom suggests otherwise. Some structures must dissolve for balance to return. This does not imply abandonment. It implies prioritization. Knowing what must endure matters more than knowing what can be protected temporarily. The flood then becomes a filter. It removes rigidity and rewards adaptability. Cultures that remembered this lesson rebuilt differently, lighter, more attentive, less certain. The symbolic role of Three-Eye Atlas within this framework remains consistent. It is not a threat. It is a reminder that the environment includes dimensions beyond immediate control, that resilience begins with humility. As the narrative approaches its final act, the emphasis shifts from theory to reflection. What kind of continuity does modern humanity seek? One based on preservation of form, or one grounded in preservation of meaning? Ancient stories offer no instructions for technology or policy. They offer posture. Listen before acting. Observe before assuming. Prepare before momentum replaces choice. The cycle will continue, with or without recognition. The difference lies in how humanity meets it, whether with surprise and loss of orientation, or with calm adaptation guided by memory carried forward deliberately. The flood recedes in every story. What remains is not water, but awareness. And that awareness, fragile yet renewable, is the true inheritance passed quietly through time, waiting for each generation to decide whether it will be remembered or allowed to fade once more. That inherited awareness carries the narrative into its most philosophical layer. Ancient flood myths do not ask humanity to defeat cycles. They ask it to recognize participation within them. This distinction reshapes responsibility. The goal is not permanence, but coherence across change. In many traditions, time itself is portrayed as layered rather than linear. Past, present, and future overlap through pattern. Floods recur not because history repeats mechanically, but because conditions recur. When balance drifts, correction follows. The system remembers, even when humanity forgets. This view reframes loss. What disappears in a reset is not erased without reason. It is removed because it no longer fits the conditions sustaining the world. Survival, therefore, is not random. It reflects compatibility with the next phase. Modern discomfort with this idea stems from attachment to continuity of form. Ancient cultures were more concerned with continuity of function. They accepted that landscapes, cities, and even social orders could vanish, while knowledge and orientation endured. Flood myths preserve this acceptance gently. They do not glorify collapse. They normalize transition. They suggest that fear arises not from change itself, but from resisting it. Within this philosophical frame, celestial signs regain their quiet authority. They symbolize scales beyond human negotiation. The sky reminds societies that control is partial and that humility is adaptive. Three-Eye Atlas, passing briefly through awareness, fits this role precisely. It does not disrupt the system. It disrupts assumption. It invites reflection on scale, timing, and openness. As this act unfolds, the narrative turns inward. The question becomes not what will happen next, but how meaning is carried forward when change arrives. Whether humanity defines itself by what it builds or by what it understands. The ancient answer leans toward understanding. Structures fall, awareness travels, the flood passes, the cycle turns, and what endures is not certainty, but the capacity to orient oneself within an ever-changing world. That capacity for orientation defines the deepest contrast between ancient and modern worldviews. Ancient societies assumed instability and trained attention accordingly. Modern society assumes stability and reacts when it fails. This reversal shapes every response to risk. Flood myths challenge this reversal without confrontation. They simply show what happens when attention drifts. Warnings appear. They are debated, minimized, or reinterpreted. Delay accumulates. Momentum replaces choice. This sequence is preserved across continents because it reflects human behavior as much as environmental process. The reset is not only physical, it is cultural. It exposes habits of perception. In ancient accounts, those who survive are not those with the most resources, but those with the clearest sense of sequence. They act early, quietly, and without consensus. Their preparation seems unnecessary until it becomes essential. Modern frameworks often discourage this posture. Action without certainty is criticized. Precaution is delayed until justification is complete. Ancient wisdom offers an alternative. It values responsiveness over proof. The flood myths encode this value carefully. They show that certainty arrives last when options are gone. Awareness arrives first when adaptation is still possible. This insight is not pessimistic. It is pragmatic. It recognizes that complex systems do not announce thresholds loudly. They whisper through anomalies, irregularities, and subtle shifts. The presence of Three-Eye Atlas resonates here once again. It is not dramatic, it is anomalous. Its significance lies not in impact, but in attention. As this chapter continues, the narrative approaches its closing reflection. The floods of the past are not warnings of doom. They are reminders of posture. They ask whether humanity can relearn how to listen before reacting, how to prepare without panic, and how to adapt without clinging to forms that no longer fit the world taking shape. That posture of listening defines the final inheritance of the flood stories. They do not end with certainty. They end with openness, a recognition that the world is dynamic and that meaning must move with it. Ancient cultures accepted that each age would misunderstand the previous one. Stories were not preserved to guarantee understanding, but to offer opportunity. Each generation could rediscover relevance if it chose to look deeply enough. Flood myths endure because they are incomplete by design. They leave space for interpretation. They do not dictate response. They invite reflection. This openness is their strength. It allows the same story to speak during different phases of the cycle. During stability, it cautions against complacency. During disruption, it offers orientation. After the reset, it guides rebuilding. Modern society often seeks definitive answers. Ancient wisdom suggests that definitive answers belong to static systems. Living systems require ongoing interpretation. The relevance of Three-Eye Atlas, once more, lies in this invitation. It does not explain the past or predict the future. It invites comparison. It draws attention to continuity between ancient observation and modern awareness. As the narrative moves toward its final blocks, the emphasis softens. There is no urgency, no alarm, only perspective, the understanding that humanity has faced profound change before, and that survival has always depended less on control than on memory, humility, and adaptability. The flood recedes into story. The water dries. The land stabilizes. Life continues. And yet, beneath that calm, the cycle waits. The ancient stories remain, not as prophecies, but as companions. Quiet reminders that the world listens to balance, that change is patient, and that those who remember how to listen may find continuity even when the ground beneath them shifts once again. That quiet companionship offered by ancient stories carries the narrative into reflection rather than resolution. Flood myths do not close the cycle. They acknowledge it. They accept that understanding is provisional, renewed only through attention. What survives is not certainty, but readiness to interpret again. In the final acts of these traditions, the world is calm. Water has withdrawn. Fields are replanted. Time resumes its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath this normalcy lies awareness that stability is conditional. The survivors know something their descendants may not, that the ground they walk on has shifted before and will shift again. This awareness shapes identity. Ancient cultures defined themselves not by uninterrupted continuity, but by resilience across interruption. The flood becomes part of origin, not as trauma alone, but as reference. It explains why restraint matters, why excess invites correction, and why humility is adaptive. Modern culture often seeks origins without rupture. It prefers stories of steady ascent. Flood myths complicate this preference. They insist that beginnings often follow endings, and that renewal is inseparable from loss. The presence of Three-Eye Atlas within this long arc reinforces that complexity. It does not offer a narrative of threat, it offers scale. It places human history within a broader environment where change is normal and continuity must be cultivated. As this act deepens, the emphasis rests on inheritance. What kind of memory is passed forward when calm returns? Whether stories remain active or fade into background noise. Ancient wisdom suggests that the most dangerous moment is not catastrophe, but comfort. When the flood is distant, attention drifts. When attention drifts, cycles repeat unseen. The lesson is not to fear change, but to remain awake within it. To recognize that meaning is not fixed, but carried, adjusted, and renewed as conditions evolve. That renewal of meaning defines the final movement of the flood narrative. Ancient cultures understood that memory must be revisited to remain useful. Stories were not preserved to be admired, but to be re-entered. Each retelling was an act of recalibration. Flood myths were told slowly, deliberately, often during times of stability rather than crisis. This timing mattered. Reflection was easier when fear was absent. Awareness could be cultivated without urgency. Modern society often postpones reflection until disruption forces it. Ancient wisdom reverses this order. It teaches that the proper moment for preparation is during calm, when choices are still open. The reset hypothesis aligns with this timing. It does not call for alarm. It calls for attention. It suggests that cycles unfold patiently, offering long intervals for recognition before momentum takes over. Three-Eye Atlas appears within one of those intervals. Its passage is brief, but its symbolism lingers. It reminds humanity that the sky remains active, that external influences exist, and that history is shaped by more than immediate concerns. Flood myths persist because they speak across these intervals. They do not insist on interpretation. They wait. They trust that relevance will return when conditions align. As the narrative approaches closure, the question becomes personal rather than theoretical. How does one live within a system that changes? How does one prepare without panic, adapt without surrender, and remember without clinging? Ancient stories offer a simple answer. By listening, by observing pattern, by carrying forward what matters lightly enough to move, yet firmly enough to endure. That lightness of endurance shapes the final reflection. The flood, across cultures, is not remembered as an ending, but as a passage, a narrowing through which only essentials pass. What emerges is not a perfected world, but a recalibrated one. Ancient cultures accepted that no generation completes the cycle. Each participates briefly, inheriting memory and passing it on incomplete. This humility allowed continuity without illusion of final control. Modern humanity stands within that same passage, surrounded by knowledge, yet challenged by integration, capable of observation, yet vulnerable to distraction. The ancient stories do not judge this condition, they recognize it. The meaning of the flood, then, is not prediction. It is orientation. It reminds humanity that change is neither punishment nor failure. It is context. Three-Eye Atlas, fleeting and distant, serves as a final echo of that reminder. It passes without consequence, yet invites perspective. It suggests that the sky still speaks quietly, not in commands, but in patterns waiting to be noticed. As this chapter draws toward its close, there is no conclusion offered, only continuity. The cycle turns, memory fades and returns, awareness sharpens and dulls. The flood recedes into story once more. The land appears solid, life continues, and somewhere within that calm, the ancient question remains, patient and unresolved. Will humanity remember how to listen before the next turning? Or will the water, as it has before, become the messenger that restores attention when memory grows quiet again? That unresolved question carries the listener into the final calm of reflection. Ancient flood narratives do not seek answers. They seek awareness. They accept uncertainty as permanent and teach presence within it. The world is not something to be solved, but something to be read continuously. In this reading, the flood is a punctuation mark rather than a conclusion. It interrupts momentum, forcing attention back to fundamentals. Land, water, sky, and time realign, and humanity must rediscover its place among them. This rediscovery is never complete. It is renewed with each generation. Ancient cultures understood that forgetting was inevitable. They did not expect vigilance to last forever. That is why stories were designed to endure longer than certainty. When knowledge faded, narrative remained, waiting to be reactivated. Modern society inherits these stories at a distance. Surrounded by immediacy, it often overlooks the quiet language of cycles. Yet the stories persist, resurfacing whenever stability feels uncertain, whenever patterns begin to echo earlier turning points. The relevance of 3i Atlas rests here. It does not demand belief or reaction. It simply reminds humanity that the environment extends beyond the familiar, that the sky has always been part of the equation. It invites pause. Flood myths teach that pause is powerful. It creates space between signal and response, between awareness and momentum. In that space, choice still exists. As the narrative settles, the emphasis is no longer on catastrophe, but on posture, how one stands within change, how one carries memory without fear, how one prepares without assuming inevitability. The ancient stories offer no promise of safety. They offer continuity of meaning. They suggest that even when landscapes vanish, understanding can survive. The water recedes. Silence returns. And within that silence, the opportunity to remember remains, open and unforced, waiting for those willing to listen without urgency and to recognize that calm itself is part of the cycle, not its end. That silence is not emptiness, it is potential. Ancient flood myths end not with explanation, but with space for reflection. They trust that meaning unfolds slowly, shaped by attention rather than instruction. In this final quiet, humanity is placed back into the flow of time, no longer observing catastrophe but living within aftermath. The challenge becomes subtle, to retain awareness without constant reminder, to live responsibly without immediate threat. Ancient cultures approach this challenge through repetition. Stories were retold not to warn but to align. Each telling reintroduced perspective gently, without urgency. Memory was sustained through rhythm rather than alarm. Modern life resists this rhythm. Speed replaces repetition. Novelty replaces return. Yet cycles do not respond to speed. They respond to accumulation. Flood myths endure because they slow perception, inviting long vision. The appearance of 3i Atlas, brief and distant, fits naturally into this rhythm. It passes quickly, leaving only the question of what was noticed while it was there. Its value lies not in duration, but in interruption of assumption. As this chapter nears its close, the narrative does not ask for belief. It asks for patience, for willingness to see the present as part of a longer movement rather than a final state. The flood, remembered across cultures, becomes a shared meditation on impermanence. It teaches that change does not announce itself loudly, and that survival favors those who notice early, prepare quietly, and adapt without resentment. In the end, the stories do not belong to the past. They belong to anyone living within systems shaped by cycles. They remain available, unchanged, waiting to be read again when conditions invite reflection. The silence holds. the world continues. And somewhere between memory and forgetting, the ancient lesson remains intact, neither demanding nor disappearing, simply present. That presence is the final gift of the flood stories. They do not resolve the cycle, they accompany it. Like a distant horizon, they offer orientation without insisting on destination. Ancient cultures understood that no generation escapes change. Each inherits a moment within a larger rhythm, participates briefly, and passes the question forward. The flood marks one of those moments, remembered because it revealed what mattered when everything else was stripped away. What mattered was not permanence, but understanding, not control, but alignment, not certainty, but attentiveness. Modern humanity stands within the same unfinished story, surrounded by knowledge, yet still subject to forces beyond design, capable of great foresight, yet vulnerable to forgetting. The ancient narratives do not judge this condition, they recognize it. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas fades from view, as all signs eventually do. What remains is the choice of interpretation, whether it was seen as noise or as part of a longer conversation between sky and earth, memory and change. Flood myths suggest that the most important inheritance is not prediction, but posture. How one meets uncertainty, how one carries awareness through calm, how one listens when the world speaks softly rather than urgently. As this chapter closes, there is no warning issued, no future declared, only continuity. The cycle turns, memory sleeps and awakens. The world reshapes itself patiently, and within that patience, the ancient stories remain, not as relics, but as quiet companions, reminding humanity that the flood has come before, that it will take many forms, and that survival, in its deepest sense, begins long before water rises, in the simple, deliberate act of remembering how to listen.